So the task assigned to me this afternoon, which I should go through in a very straightforward manner, since we do not have enough time, is authentic assessment and something that comes with it in tandem, rubric development. So for this workshop, I hope to go very quickly over some basic frameworks for assessment, which Dr. Adriano has already mentioned. Some of which she has already discussed this morning. Looking at authentic assessment and its features vis-a-vis traditional assessment, the development of rubrics and other concerns that relate to these ideas. Dr. Already mentioned a framework for assessment that has changed in terms of the stance in which we look the purposes of assessment, which is of, for, and as learning. The traditional assessment pyramid has more of the pyramid focusing on summative assessment and only a very few small portion of the pyramid for us and for learning. But Pearl and other educators have kind of upended the pyramid, and they're saying that with student-centered instruction, we will now focus on assessment for and especially as learning. So you'll notice that your discussions on self-assessment, which is one of the most neglected aspects of assessment in our classrooms, is actually given the largest portion in this pyramid. It is looking at the student as a learner and as someone who should be in control of his own learning. And so the learner has to be very aware of his strengths and weaknesses as a learner. And so he should be self-motivated to fix his problems and capitalize on his strengths as a learner. However, I still have another thing that comes with it, but I will mention that later. So in relation to this assessment as purpose in mind, with purpose in mind paradigm, practical considerations indicate that assessment is more than just the giving of grades. And I think this is one paradigm that we have to change among our colleagues in the field and also among parents and students. It should provide feedback for both instructors and students. Assessment, as Dr. A has mentioned, drives student learning. And assessment also, of course, drives course development. I was expecting that more of the participants come from the university and tertiary levels. So the other framework that I will show you has to do with how your course assessment actually should go upward up to maybe even the university goals in relation to how you develop your assessment activities. So maybe some of us forget, but actually the course development model requires us to look at the whole university system and look at its university mission. At the program level, look at program competencies, and at the course level, look at course outcomes. And how these are achieved through unit objectives, activities, and assessment activities. But in relation to authentic assessment, we'll start with a definition given by one of my favorite gurus of authentic assessment, that's Jonathan Muller. He says it's a form of assessment in which students are asked to perform real-world tasks that demonstrate meaningful application of knowledge and skills. And Wiggins adds that it requires engaging and worthy problems or questions of importance in which students must use knowledge to fashion performances effectively and creatively. The tasks are either replicas or analogous to the kinds of problems faced by adult citizens and consumers in the field. So that is what makes the whole thing authentic. Synonymous to authentic assessment are some terms that are also often used. One such phrase is performance assessment, and the other is alternative assessment. It's because mostly authentic assessment requires the performance of a particular skill. Sometimes specialists differentiate between performance and authentic assessment by using the phrase performance-based assessment. Because there might be authentic assessment which may focus more on product, but performance-based assessment will focus more on process. And the term alternative, of course, obviously means that these types of assessment are alternatives to what we call as traditional assessment. And when we say performance assessment, again, it calls on the examinee to demonstrate specific skills and competencies to show that they have mastered some kind of knowledge or skill. An authentic assessment or performance-based assessment usually includes a task for students to perform and a rubric by which their performance on the task will be evaluated. So again, we can understand more fully the features of authentic or performance-based assessment by looking at its features or by comparing it with what we call as traditional assessment or TA, which refers to the forced choice measures of multiple choice tests, fill in the blanks, true, false, matching, and the like that have been and remain so common in education. In these tasks, students typically select an answer or recall information to complete the assessment. They may be standardized or teacher-created, and they may be administered locally, nationwide, or internationally. I believe the NAT achievement tests in the basic education are of this type, maybe also even the LET and the other board exams, although I think some board exams will include some performance-based assessment. There are, of course, similarities between TA and AA. Let's see. Traditional assessment, of course, is based on the belief by our schools and education system that the primary mission of schools is to develop productive citizens. To be a productive citizen, an individual must possess a certain body of knowledge and skills. Therefore, schools must teach this body of knowledge and skills. To determine if it is successful, the school must then test students to see if they have acquired the knowledge and skills. In other words, traditional assessment is curriculum-driven. The body of knowledge or skills is determined first, okay, before assessment activities or tools are identified. On the other hand, authentic assessment also believes in the same thing. The primary mission of schools is to develop productive citizens. So that's a similarity. To be productive, to be a productive citizen, an individual must be capable of performing meaningful tasks in the real world. So yun naman, stemming from the same belief, pero iba yung operationalization of that belief. To be a productive citizen, authentic assessment advocates believe that an individual must be capable of performing meaningful tasks in the real world. Therefore, schools must help students become proficient at performing the tasks they will encounter when they graduate. And to determine if schools are successful in this, then they must ask students to perform the meaningful tasks that replicate real-world challenges to see if students are capable of doing so. So starting from the same premise, they depart in terms of operationalizing that premise. Okay, the next framework that's why it says assessment drives the curriculum. In the other one, curriculum drives assessment. So this is the principle that is shown in Higgins and McTee's backward design. You're familiar with understanding by design principles. So the assessment principles of UBD make use of this backward design. And I think that was mentioned by Dr. Adriano this morning. And basically, it's first looking at your learning outcomes. So there. The steps in the backward design is first you identify the learning outcomes or desired results or your course objectives or your standards. And when you do that, then you already ask the question, how will I know that I have achieved these outcomes? How will I know that I have met the standards? So you already think of assessment even before you think of the learning strategies. So they call this parang backward. Because traditionally, the assessment always comes at the end. It's like it's always separate from the instruction. If you look at lesson plans, the last step is evaluation. No? Parang nothing happens in terms of assessment from the beginning of the lesson. It always comes at the end, and it's always separated from the instruction. But here, assessment, when you think of outcomes, you already think of how will I know if the outcomes have been achieved. So assessment is already at the front of your mind, even before you think of learning activities. And in authentic assessments, they go together. It's like a tandem bike. Wherever one goes, the other one will follow. So when you have the assessment, the learning outcomes, and then the assessment in mind, actually the learning experiences can become also the vehicles for assessment. It's not a separate thing. So, but even if we have these contradicting features, we should always remember that these are not mutually exclusive things. One complements the other. And in implementing a curriculum, there are portions of the curriculum which we assess through traditional assessments, and there are some which we assess through authentic assessment. So I think it's a matter of finding the appropriate assessment strategies that are also developmentally appropriate to the abilities, the interests, and needs of our students, at the same time aligned with our learning outcomes. To further look at the distinctions between TA and AA, there are some differentiated features, different distinguishing features. For traditional assessment, it usually involves the examinee to select a response from given options, okay? Whereas in AA, it asks the examinee to perform a task. So in a sense, the activities assessment of TA is contrived. Parang in the real world, you are not really asked, multiple choice, to show your knowledge. You are not asked a multiple choice question out there, but rather, you have to show your skill. And this is especially true in many professions, such as a doctor. Imagine if you choose doctors by them taking an exam. Even if he tapped the board, if he cannot perform surgery well, I will not go to that doctor at all. Are you Dr. Stephen Chua? I'm sure you have passed all the performance exams for doctors, or for electricians and plumbers. You will not get them. But even if a driver has to show his proficiency in driving, he should also pass the tests required. About the rules of traffic rules and all. So it's not either. But I would hire a driver that passed both performance and multiple choice or whatever it is they ask in those written exams. So mostly because of the format, TA items require just recall and recognition. And if you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, these are the lower level types of cognitive thinking. And performance-based assessment requires students to usually show application of skills and knowledge. They construct meaning. They have the constructivist nature of learning is more shown in the AA items. Mostly TA items are teacher structured, but AA items can be student structured. So there's more student centered principles involved there. And even if you get perfect in a test, the score is just an indirect evidence of the knowledge or skill that has been taught. Whereas AA tasks shows you direct evidence of the acquisition of the knowledge or skill. So there. You have heard of the phrase teaching to the test, right? Who has heard that? And when that is mentioned, parang has always a negative connotation. Their curriculum, some of the Southeast Asian countries, they are criticized because they teach to the test. So, and then the students will say, Miss, will this thing that you are teaching, will this appear in the test? And if you say, it will not, then they will not listen to you or something like that. People, parents, students are always looking at the test. Maybe at the end of it's a nationwide high-stakes kind of test. So everything that you should teach in the curriculum should be tailored to the test. Okay? So basically, this is what happens when you have the TA formats for assessment. Why? Because when you use the traditional assessment, you just use a sample of the body of knowledge and skills that have been taught in the curriculum. You cannot test all of them. So you get a sampling and you hope that that is representative of what the student has learned. However, giving him due advantage by teaching to the test violates the principles because it gives the children, just focusing on that, and that's not really guarantee that the body of skills and knowledge and attitudes have been acquired. Whereas that's the TA framework. Whereas in AA, you do teach to the test. Because you even give them the rubric beforehand. This is what we require of you. This is the points that you will get. So what they will show, is that cheating, you think? When you give them this test blueprint, the review questions, etc. No, because there's no mimicry in AA, whereas there's a lot of copying that can be done in TA. In AA, it's self-constructed. So, the performance of one child will be different from another. So, in terms of giving them the rubric, explaining what the exam will be about, or what the performance test will be about is fine. So, in effect, you encourage actually teachers to teach to the test. Because the test is a meaningful performance of direct evidence of skills and knowledge that are supposed to be learned. So, to summarize, why should we use authentic assessment? They are direct measures of skills and knowledge learned. They capture the constructive nature of learning. So we give children opportunities to construct their own interpretation of reality and things. And they integrate teaching, learning, and assessment. So sometimes, as I've said, the projects that enable the learning of the skill also become the vehicle for the assessment itself. So the teaching and learning, instruction and assessment are very much integrated. And they provide multiple paths to demonstration. Like there's one skill, one child can do a music video, one child can do a dance performance, another child can do poetry, another child can write a story, it kind of embodies the principles of different learning styles, different abilities, different interests, and multiple intelligences. So all of these principles are taken into consideration. Of course, I think it challenges the creativity of the teacher to think of these many multiple paths and giving options for the children to choose which suits them and all. So, there are 4 questions that we need to answer or ask along the way when we construct authentic assessment activities. The first question is, what should the students know and be able to do? So, the list of the skills and knowledge that answer these questions become your standards. And from there, your next question is, what indicates students have met the standards? Okay, how do you know that the standards have been met? That would be your authentic tasks. So that's the second step. The third question is, what does good performance on this task look like? And that would translate to what we call criteria and levels of performance. And fourth, how well did the students perform? That's where your rubric will come in. Okay, and in terms of the rubric or the fourth concern or stage, there are 2 sub-questions that you can ask. How well should most students perform? And the answer to that question is your cut score or benchmark. And the other question is, what do students need to improve upon based on their performance? And that's when you have information that will help you adjust instruction. And this is what we mean by my new paradigm, which I picked up very recently because of my work in ACT-RC. And from this framework, which have already been upended to more assessment as and for learning instead of assessment of learning, to from our stance, assessment is for teaching. So aside from the student-centered instruction, let's look at assessment activities from our own point of view as instructors or as teachers. So what do we need to do with assessment so that we can make intelligent instructional decisions? So why do we assess? It's not just to give grades, as we've said. It's to improve instruction so that our students will learn better. So first, types of activities, knowing the aligning learning outcomes with assessment activities. But I think one big deficiency in our school system, especially in the basic education program, is that teachers lack the know-how and the knowledge to interpret data and to use that data for instruction. For instance, sino dito ang nasa basic ed? Kayo, ma'am, ano? For example, before you had the PhilErie, I know there is a new national assessment framework with the K-12 curriculum. But before that, the elementary assessment measure nationwide is called the PhilErie, Philippine Informal Reading Inventory. And almost all teachers that we have asked regarding PhilErie will say, okay, we have this scores. What do we do now? Also, your national assessment scores. Year in and year out, the N80 statistics will say, our students do not meet the 75. You are familiar with that? No, it's a recurring refrain. All these years, it seems that our teachers are not doing anything because there's no improvement in NAT data. Is it a function of teacher quality or is it a function of the assessment? But nobody has really looked at what the NAT assesses, no? And besides, what is its use for teachers? By the time you get the scores, your students have gone on to second grade above because, the results come maybe 2 years later. And when they come, They're just in the form of scores. What does a 75 mean? What does a 50 mean? What does the 50? What do I do with these children with 50? What do I do with these children? Where are they in the progression of skills? Now, so, in terms of basic education, which is more difficult because you cut across year levels, you really look at competencies in terms of a progression of skills. And the most important information for the teacher is to know at which point of the scale each child is. And that is what you call the zone of proximal development. We always say the zone of proximal development, to me it has always been a twilight zone of proximal development. What is that? How do you identify that? Where do you find information on which is the CPD of this child in relation to this comprehension scale? What is his CPD in relation to the math, competency, etc.? The assessment tools that we use, including the NAT, do not really identify these points. Because when we are able to identify those points, then we can have more intelligent information on differentiated instruction. You see, 7 children in my class are at this point, so I will group them and give them instruction so that they will move to the next stage. Because that is, di ba, yun ang idea ng zone of proximal development. It's the 50-50 stage where you either fail or pass. So there has to be instruction to move the child along to the next level. But that information, the teacher does not have. So we need a lot of training. We need a lot of reforms in terms of assessment itself, because it seems that most of the assessment that still goes on in the field are summative forms rather than formative assessment forms. So we want to change that paradigm. I'm speaking as ACT-RC representative to this focus on assessment is for teaching and coming up with assessment tools that specifically identify a child's placement along a progression of scale, progressive scale in a skill, so that children will know what to do. What to do with these kids who are at this level, what to do with these kids who are at a more advanced level, and so on. Okay, so going back to summary of steps in authentic assessment, we said first we identify your standards. Those who are teaching in college, maybe you do not work in terms of standards. We do that for K-12, for example. But rather you work with narrower course objectives. So you have your course goals, which are translated into more specific course objectives. So that would be your number one. What are your course objectives? And next, you develop a task which students could perform that would indicate they have met the standard or standards. Next, criteria. Okay, we identify the criteria of good performance that, if present in your students' work, will indicate that they have performed well on the task. And fourth, for each criterion, we usually identify 2 or more levels of performance along which students can perform, which will sufficiently discriminate among students. So who are the basic, advanced, middle, or who needs improvement, who are more exceptional, and so on. So the combination of the criteria and the levels of performance for that criterion will be your rubric for the task. Okay, let's go back. So let's go look at each step one at a time. Standards. Again, you can say course objectives rather than standards. This is a very cliche. Everyone can say this when they're asleep. Should be observable and measurable. A standard is typically more narrow than a goal and broader than an objective. So Muller gives us this inverted pyramid. They are so obsessed with pyramids. But from broad to narrow, so first you have the mission statement of your program or your college or even your university. And these are, mission statements are good for wall hangings, but not much else. Okay? You have to translate them into more specific goals in terms of your, and then you will have maybe 4 or 5, but then you translate it into narrower, more specific, and accessible statements such as standards, and maybe even narrower as objectives. Standards kasi can straddle across grade levels, can be for a whole unit, but objectives usually is at the lesson plan level. So the narrower, the more numerous. So there are more objectives than goals because the goals are translated in the whole, translated into a unit standard, and the standards are translated into lesson objectives. So then they become narrower and more numerous in that sense. A standard, according to the gurus, should not include mention of the specific task by which students will demonstrate what they know or are able to do, which should be left out of the statement according to this guideline, using a Venn diagram, because it limits your paths to assessment, because identification of cultural similarities and differences can be assessed not just through a Venn diagram, but in many other ways. As I've said, maybe you can even give options for students choosing which performance they will do. So we avoid using a specific task in that sense. And obviously, they should be written clearly and in a language that students, and especially in basic ed, parents can understand. Okay, the next step is selecting an authentic task. First, look at your standard. Again, go back to your objectives. Next, look at the real world out there, not inside the classroom. Okay, what are the things that are done to show that that skill or the body of knowledge has been acquired before creating the task? So, for example, if you have this standard, students will describe the geographic, economic, social, and political consequences of the Revolutionary War. You can use several types of assessments. It can be an analytic paper. It may be a multimedia presentation. It may be in the form of a debate. So that's also collaborative in that sense. Some of these are individual, some may be group work. And it can actually be an essay question on a test. So it can be a pencil paper thing. An essay question is kind of straddles the border. It's on the border between traditional and authentic assessment. I think it's in the nature of the essay, the question being answered by the essay, that makes it either authentic or traditional. For example, aside from that, being authentic in the real world, do not forget that assessment should be fun. Assessment activities should also be engaging. It's not always serious. Para kang mag-take ng board, para mag-take ka ng upkat na you always worry and are not able to sleep. No, but how can you make the skill, real-world skills, authentic, but at the same time engaging? So, for example, for mathematics, using addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, you can have an activity where they follow a recipe, or they use that for ordering pizza. Maybe you can have a simulated activity, but you can have a real activity, a party on Friday, and we will order pizza, and you apply all this. Who will buy the pizza is the main problem. The teacher, because she received the bonus. Okay, and then, for example, measuring the painting of a room. No? So you have this problem. And so many of these are actually simulations of real-world problems. But then they become engaging because they know that they can easily apply this to real-world problems out there. Criteria. Okay, criteria is the third. Okay, creating the criteria. These are the indicators of good performance on a task. The questions to ask include, what does good performance of this task look like? And how will I know they have done a good job on this task? So it takes you always back to your learning outcome. What is your purpose? How will you show that the learning outcome has been achieved? And what are the specific features of these criteria? First, let's look at how they should be stated. I think these are self-explanatory. I'll not read them anymore. But it's the same criteria that applies to the statement of learning outcomes, actually. So now, the fourth stage. So I am the second part of my presentation, which is the rubrics making. Everyone mentioned the rubric yesterday, so this is not a new thing to you. Many of you are already using rubrics for particular types of authentic assessment. And we know, of course, that that is your marking scheme or your scoring scale to assess student performance along a task-specific set of criteria. So we know, with this, we know that authentic assessment are typically criterion referenced. So the student's aptitude in the task is determined by matching his performance against the set of criteria. So that's criterion reference. So an example here is a research rubric. Okay, so you have the criteria here, which includes number of sources cited, historical accuracy, organization, and bibliography. Then you have here the levels of performance. There are 3, and they are weighted. So you will know that the teacher puts more premium on this particular criterion. That's why the points here will be multiplied by 3. Okay, so there are different weights. Okay, so this is just one example of, I think it's an analytic rubric. These things here that specifies what is expected of each student for each cell are called descriptors. Okay, so these descriptors spell out what is expected of students at each level of performance. In this example, there are no descriptors, just the criteria and labels for the different levels of performance. So you can actually start with that and maybe later on expand it to include the descriptors. So why should we include levels of performance? I myself are more, I like when I can make analytic rubrics more than holistic rubrics. But of course, there are uses for holistic rubrics also. Because the levels of performance give clearer expectations to students. So they will know what is exactly or what is at most expected of them with the project or the assignment. And you are in a position to make this more consistent with objective assessment. So there is less subjectivity. So in performance assessment, syempre, there's more, kumbaga sabi nila, subjective judgment involved than with traditional assessment. Because in traditional assessment, you have only one correct answer, such as a multiple choice item. But to make it less subjective, then it's good if you have levels of performance and descriptors within the levels of performance. So that when there's more than one rater, then there will be higher inter-rater ability. For us who are teaching the course, we might be just the ones. So sometimes we become lazy. We do not write them down, but they are here. And we know that this one is 1, this one is 3, this one is 5, because these are the features that are there. We don't need to write them down because it's for our own. And we have been using it for semesters, right? You are laughing there kasi sabi nang tatatamad naman akong ilagay ko itong lahat. But if you are doing it for the whole department and you're going to sit with other colleagues who are teaching the same course, then it would be good to have these levels of performance. Then inter-reliability ratings would be increased. Right now, for example, in our department, when there is more than one section offered for the term, we usually approach it with collaborative syllabus, and then we think of the requirements, and we make the assignment guides. The exams we make collaboratively, and then we make the rubrics. And then sometimes when we rate, we exchange. Like I also rate some part of class section even if I do not teach them using the same rubric, and the other professor will also rate some aspect of the exam of my students. So for this, you need more analytic rubrics. And especially if you are doing it for K-12 curriculum, because you have all these standards, and you have to do it for the division-wide test, you have to do it for the region-wide test, you have to do it for the nation-wide test. So the rubrics, if they get to the level of authentic assessment, should be more analytic than holistic. So the analytic rubric articulates levels of performance for each criterion as shown in the examples, so the teacher can assess student performance on each criterion. And holistic rubrics are, I think, easier to do because they do not list separate levels of performance. Rather, they assign a level of performance by assessing performance across multiple criteria as a whole. So for the same researcher ratings, you can just have this poor researcher, good researcher, excellent researcher. But there are uses for both. Sometimes, when do you use analytic rubric? When it's a more complex kind of project or assignment and there are several criteria, it's good also, as Dr. Adriano has emphasized, that you assign points for each criteria so that when you check, it becomes more objective. My professor in assessment last January says, there's also content validity, all these things about reliability, the usual psychometric principles. And we have another type of validity, and that's called declarative validity. Do you know what it is? When the teacher says, I declare that this is valid, and that's declarative validity. Anyway, we're testing. I declare that it's valid. Anyway, holistic rubrics would perhaps apply when you just want a quick or gross judgment that needs to be made of the student. If the assignment is a minor one, to quickly review student work. But for more substantial assignments, when it is not easy to evaluate performance on one criterion independently of performance of another criterion, so then you make it more holistic because they relate to each other. Now, levels of performance, what are some considerations? This will vary depending on our tasks and our needs. A rubric for our class is always work in progress. I always use that. A work in progress. Hindi siya nakataga as a stone. Sometimes you tweak the project a little, so then you have to change the rubric somehow. You change the nature of the task, then you also change the rubric. And so the guideline or the suggestion given to us is to start with a smaller number of levels of performance, then expand when necessary. For instance, if you have this as one of your criteria for making oral presentations, and that is making eye contact with the audience, so you might just have levels of never, sometimes or always, but you might use a more expanded one to include later. When you apply the rubric, you think that there are in between types of performance. So maybe you will have never, rarely, sometimes, usually, always. But then you can actually shrink that a bit because you say that almost all speakers will not always maintain eye contact. So maybe you remove the always there because it's not realistic anyway. Again, for holistic rubric, we also start small. Likewise, maybe just this. Check. Check and check. Check plus. Okay, so satisfactory, unsatisfactory, not applicable or not attempted. Or just like that. No? So especially for smaller assignments. But then maybe you have to explain to students what is meant by satisfactory and what is meant by unsatisfactory. Then you will have to have some kind of descriptors, something like this. So at the level of inadequate level because of these descriptors, developing stage, proficient level, and mastery level. Who has had extensive experience in using rubrics, both for your own class or for other, clientele? Like if you develop tests for your admissions exam, for UPCAT, for LAE, maybe for the board. So if you have a learning outcome, the first thing that you need to do is decide on a task.
Yeah.
And then what are the features of the task? Okay? That becomes the criteria. Should it include some enumeration, exemplification? Will it include the use of a graphic organizer? Diba, no? Will it include asking questions, making summaries, and the like? A very good exercise, if you do it for your department or for your division, a very good exercise on this that I learned from the assessment course I took just several months ago, the University of Melbourne, has to do with teachers sitting down, and then maybe for one criterion, then you will decide what are the behaviors that will indicate lowest level, and then the next level, and then you will write this on post-its, and then you will have a grid on the board, and then you will put the post-its here. One should be higher than this one. So in the end, you get to see the range. Some are farther apart from the other, some are closer, and then you test it. So it also contributes to the progression of skill. So when you test, then you would know that this child is at this beginner level, or the child is at the intermediate level, or the child is at the proficient level.
If it has to be used for a big school, it is really important to include other people in the making of the rubrics. It would be difficult to do it on your own.
It is not a lone ranger kind of thing, because it should encompass different types of students, okay, and experiences. And that is why you have to check your rubric against, this one. If you are not working in a group, at least let a colleague review it, one who is familiar with the course you are teaching or the students that you are assessing. Let your students review it. That was also mentioned this morning, diba? You negotiate the levels of performance and then the criteria. Sometimes what you think would be easy will actually be difficult to students, so they will ask for more points on this particular criterion rather than the other one. So when I give them, for example, at the beginning of the semester, TMA guide or assignment guide with the corresponding rubrics, I will always say that this is negotiable. Later on, we will decide that this requirement maybe will need more points than the other requirements because you found out that you spent more time on it. There were more difficulties encountered when doing the assignment and so on. Then, of course, check if it aligns or matches up with your standards. Check if it is manageable. Consider imaginary student performance. So you have actually some students in mind. Who do you think is the best, the student who will exhibit all the features, all the levels in the criteria and all the criteria? Then who will be at kind of the middle? Who will be poor in all of these? And sometimes it's easy to pull real specimens. But once you have pilot tested it, then you can actually look at actual performance and see that, oh, I have not covered this criterion, but it appears in the performance of the student. So you add that to your rubric. Or you see that maybe you have become redundant. One criterion may actually repeat another criterion, so maybe you have to streamline that one. So it's actually always a work in progress. And of course, you do not need to reinvent the wheel. There are oodles of websites that give you all the, rubrics for all kinds of courses, for all kinds of levels. So sometimes you just have to use existing rubrics out there. There's what you call the rubric generator. They'll just give you the template and you'll just fill out the matrices. So it's easy enough. You don't have to construct those things. Adapt them a bit. In relation to not just rubrics but also assessment activities and tools, you can find them all, most of them all online. As we've said, some universities have shared online their own syllabi and their own exams, like the MIT. If you're teaching architecture, if you're teaching medicine, you can just look at that site and you will get lots of examples for assessment, authentic assessment. Okay, now, all of those principles, we should underpin assessment activities, whether offline or online. And because those are basic things. So it does not matter what is your learning environment. Those are principles that should underpin assessment activities. But the online environment has brought convenience to instruction and assessment in some ways. However, it has also brought some additional concerns that are not there in residential assessment. So the call to move beyond traditional means of identifying what students know and what they can do at the end of a course will have these concerns. Are there new learning and assessment opportunities provided by the online environment? What are these? And how do we make use of those opportunities? And then, how do I translate from my F to F, meaning face-to-face assessment praxis, into the online mode or environment? But on top of this, you also have these concerns, which are not there when you have face-to-face instruction. Is the student who has enrolled in the course the one taking the exam? Well, it has nothing to do with authentic or traditional, but these are administrative concerns. How do I know that students really understand what I'm teaching if I cannot see them? How can I ensure that students won't cheat? And how can I deal with plagiarism? Of course, plagiarism occurs everywhere, but it's even more, the tendency to do plagiarize their work is even more prevalent in the online environment. So maybe we can learn from some principles forwarded by Paloff and Pratt. They say there should be a variety of learning activities and assessment measures that tap different learning styles. So yung sinasabi kong multiple paths to assessment, maybe, will minimize or if not entirely eradicate those concerns about cheating and all. The top TA assessment measures will not always do because you can easily cheat when it's TA. But when you have projects, then that cannot easily be copied. And as from our experience at UPOU, especially you should do a lot of discussion forums because you get to see how the students' thinking processes are, the way they use the language, so that when they submit a paper and you think that, this is a bit different from his language, the language that the student uses in the discussion forums, so you flag it right away. This must be plagiarized or copied from somewhere else. And of course, there are applications that will easily, tell you whether this citation is in the internet, has been copied. The easiest thing is to use Google, diba? You just copy and paste certain portions of the paper and put it on Google. And sometimes the whole article appears, caught in the act agad yung student. So that's also one way to plagiarism. So you have to know your students. And one way to know them is to look at their initial submissions and the way they behave in discussion forums. Their vocabulary, their level of grammar, their syntax, and the way they organize their thoughts and so on. You can easily You know a lot about them because of such things. Okay? Learner-centered activities and assignments. And then, of course, rubrics. Also, prompt feedback. This is one of the most difficult guidelines for me to follow. Miyak culpa. I have so many things on my plate, and when you have 250 students in an online course, it's so hard to give feedback. You know, I can get as many as the. There was a time I had those 10 sections. Oh my God! So to give feedback on assignments is very hard. You have to get tutors, you have to get extra markers, and then you have to develop the rubric so that the enterator marking scheme has a high reliability. Tests and quizzes delivered online should be considered as open book measures. So at the start, you know, I use online quizzes. I give them a grade, but very minimal towards the final grade. Because I give them a window. So as I say, I open the quiz on a Friday night, and they can take the quiz any time between Friday night and Monday night. So that's actually 3 days. That already considers the Sabadistas who cannot do it on Saturday. So they still have 2 days to do it. But anyway, it's formative because my quiz is formative. What I intend for them to do, gaya ng sinabi ko kaninang umaga, is I give them two attempts at the test. So that means that if they do poorly in the first one, then they have a chance to read the references again, to study again, and take it the second time. So it's actually a measure to make them study some more if they did poorly in the first attempt. So there's that second chance. So it's more a formative assessment than a summative, even if some of them are matching types or a short answer. Because it's very hard to have constructed items on the online environment, as Roel later on will be your resource person on online quizzes. For him, you will know that, like, you have to have all the permutations. For example, you have a filling the blanks. You have to have, do you accept, for example, wrong spelling? Or baka may, for example, the answer is fry graph. And then they'll say, Fry's graph. Or some will say, Fry graph of readability. Or readability graph of Fry. All of these are correct, di ba? Pero pag isa lang yung nilagay mo, the machine will mark all the other things incorrect. So then you have to review again so that doubles or triples the work that you have to do. So then you have to have all the permutations, all the possible correct answers that can be put there so that the machine will pick it up and mark them correctly. So these are some of the disadvantages of online quizzes. The machine cannot think for you, you know. When you are doing it on your own, you can easily say, okay na yan, kahit na wrong spelling, tama naman ang sense or whatever. Then, of course, someone will talk to you about portfolio assessment. No questions at this point? I'll just give you some examples of assessment praxis to show what I have been talking about. So actually, that is from an archive part of my portal, so maybe 2-3 years ago. So let me just mention as examples my course called EDR 201, The Psychology of Reading, which is offered at the Master's Program of Language and Literacy Education. So what are the forms of assessment in that course that I use? We have asynchronous forms, written assignments submitted through the work bin in the course site, or as email attachment or by post, participation in my portal discussion forums and blogs, and as I've mentioned, sometimes online quizzes and exams. Then synchronous forms in the form of proctored exams in predetermined venues, sit-down exams in learning centers, or online proctored exams using webcam technology, mostly for students who are based overseas, who cannot go to a learning center or a testing center for sit-down proctored exams. But all of these are going back to course objectives and all. I make it so that my course guide is very, very detailed. This is an example of the course guide. It looks like that. The course guide is translated into unit study guide. So if I have 3 units, then there will be 3 study guides. And for each unit, then it will be translated into assignments or projects. So there will be TMA guides for each assignment. And each TMA guide will carry its own rubrics. So the task is very clear. That's a rubric, an example of a rubric for the assignment. And its rubric, we always include self-reflection activity. So self-reflected. So self-assessment is part of it. Then I have also a rubric for discussion forums. I need to see to it that there is interaction in the forums. Then here's an example of a quiz. And here's an example of a collaborative activity, which is done online, a web quest. Here, and then for online exams, etc., I always have a post-quiz discussion. So there is a feedback on how the quiz went. All the technology difficulties are described and summarized. So we learn a lot from each other. For example, we learned that Chrome does not work well with the online Moodle. So, and then you have to have your Java scripts, whatever, running and all those things. No, the technology glitches are avoided the second time around. So part of the online exam environment will include considerations relating to the technology, especially connectivity issues. They have to be online. Once they get offline for some reason, after 10 minutes, they are off the test. So if they're already on their second chance, then they have no more chance of taking the quiz again. That's my mea culpa, providing prompt feedback. So to summarize, these are some of the suggestions given regarding cheating and plagiarism. But again, to summarize, to end the presentation at this point, I have a second PowerPoint to show. Our basic philosophy and approach may not change, but the techniques we use to get there are likely to be different in the online environment. Especially now that technologies are getting more and more sophisticated and there are more applications that we can use. There are hot potato sites and all kinds of quiz-making applications and all. Then we can use them. We can use even mobile phones, iPads, tablets, and so on. So that gets to be more exciting. Thank you very much for your participation.